A curious phone call to Eastbourne's coroner by the town's most fashionable doctor, John Bodkin Adams, led to a sinister discovery. The doctor's wealthy patients were in the habit of dying under the influence of powerful drugs and leaving him fat legacies. Over the coming weeks, at least a dozen more suspicious deaths were uncovered, prompting one of the most sensational police investigations this century. Establishing the physician's guilt was to prove more difficult, though. Was John Bodkin Adams the doctor who quite literally got away with murder? On Sunday, July the 22nd, 1956, Dr. John Bodkin Adams begged an unusual favour of Eastbourne's coroner. He wanted him to arrange a private post-mortem for a patient who wasn't yet dead. That patient was the socialite Gertrude Hullett, known to her friends as Bobby. Bobby was a vivacious member of a set which included the top actors and performers of the time. She was recently widowed, and since her husband's death 4 months earlier, Dr. Adams had kept her heavily sedated. Eastbourne in the 50s was a retirement haven for the wealthy, and Dr. Adams' patients included many of the area's most eminent people. Over the years, he'd grown rich on their fees and the generous legacies he'd persuaded them to leave him. The doctor had brushed off sinister gossip in the town, linking his newfound wealth to his profligate use of powerful opiates. Now, the alarm bells were ringing.
He made this grave mistake of ringing and asking about the autopsy. Because another doctor had apparently asked him whether he could arrange some kind of private inquest. That was to say, his partner in the business. His partner suspected that something was going on, and his partner was probably responsible as much as anything else for the police really beginning to take an interest. But as soon as they began to take an interest in this business of women dying of drug overdoses, and realized that he'd been doing this for years and years, and that one of them was as recent as 1950, this was 1956, and that since then there was a trail of such women, then obviously, this looked like being one of the mass murderers of the century. 3 post-mortems were carried out on Bobby Hullett's body, but the inquest jury still returned a unanimous verdict of suicide from an overdose of sleeping tablets. Dr. Adams was severely reprimanded by the coroner for an extraordinary degree of careless treatment. The police had to concentrate their investigation elsewhere. They embarked on a painstaking inquiry into the doctor's professional life, and what they found was not pleasant. A picture emerged of a greedy, amoral physician. Solicitors and bank managers testified to Adams' persistence in pressing patients to alter their wills in his favour, even to the extent of guiding a dying hand. 32 wills were uncovered containing £45,000 in bequests to Adams, an enormous sum of money in the 1950s. There was also evidence of forgery, extortion, and faulty cremation certificates. Detectives believed they could establish a homicidal pattern. Dr. Adams made his victims dependent on drugs, then influenced them to change their wills in his favour, and then eased them out of life with an overdose. It was as simple as it was difficult to prove. Adams was formally charged with Edith Morell's murder. It was this case the police decided to take to court first.
Miss Adams, I'm arresting you for the murder of Mrs. Edith Morell. Do you wish to say anything in answer to the charge? You're not obliged to say anything unless you wish to do so. But whatever you say will be taken down and may be given in evidence.
Murder? Murder? Can you prove it was murder? I don't think you can prove murder. She was dying in any event.
I feel that this plea of his, that what he was doing was what many doctors admittedly do. That is, they allow their patients who are in pain to die by giving them overdoses. Happened to my own father, as a matter of fact. And, one knows that this does happen with people who are dying fairly painfully. But there's no evidence at all that any of these women who were concerned in this particular case were in fact dying painfully. And in the case of someone like Bobby Hullett, there's every evidence that she would have remained a perfectly healthy, normal, rich widow if it hadn't been for his ministrations. You see, even there he sort of told the police, oh, well, actually, I introduced them in the first place. I played Cupid. He's always fixing his eyes on something else. He's always telling himself lies. I think he was not only one of the great murderers of the 20th century, he was one of the great self-deceivers of the 20th century.
The case against Adams was this. Mrs. Morell was a bedridden invalid who needed 24-hour nursing with the doctor on constant call. The doctor began to supply her with morphine and heroin and then called in her solicitor to execute a new will, leaving him a chest of Georgian silver, a Rolls Royce, and all her jewellery. When the doctor decided to take a holiday, Mrs. Morell became resentful. So fearing she'd change her mind about the will, he pumped drugs into her until she expired.
I don't think that the crimes of Bodkin Adams involve anything that you can call cleverness. He wasn't a clever man in any way. He tended to do all this kind of thing instinctively, like a greedy child who simply wants something and goes and takes it. Therefore, he felt that when he didn't keep proper records, when he didn't sort of get the proper form in order to get them cremated and so on, he wasn't really doing anything, very seriously wrong, and he could just say, well, a busy doctor, all kinds of things slip his mind. But in point of fact, from the beginning, he'd simply got his eye on, one thing, to get as much property as he possibly could.
The trial at the Old Bailey proved a sensation in post-war Britain. But there were glaring holes in the prosecution case which centred on the evidence of two nurses who witnessed Mrs. Morell's death.
The jury had been accepting the views of various people that he had given these people huge overdoses of drugs. Now, the defence were incredibly lucky. They went and searched another house that Bodkin Adams had been in, and they found the actual notebooks of two of these nurses. And they then got Nurse Stromack into the witness box, sympathetically asked her all kinds of questions and tried to get her, as it were, to exaggerate what she'd said about the huge overdose and this giant syringe, which undoubtedly, did exist. I mean, they waved it around in court. And then he said smoothly, with tremendous dramatic touch, now, would you like to actually hear what you said? Is this your notebook full of notes on the case? And of course, it was a coup de théâtre. The whole case collapsed, so to speak, in the dramatic sense. In point of fact, I think the great mistake of the Crown was not to go on and prosecute him again for the Bobby Hullett murder, because I think they would definitely have got him on that. But since now it looked as if the thing had collapsed like a detective novel, the heart went completely out of the case, and he really did get away with murder.
At the end of a marathon 17-day trial, the jury took just 44 minutes to find Dr. John Bodkin Adams not guilty. The Attorney General announced the Crown wouldn't pursue the doctor on any further charges, and he was set free.
This enormous greed, he was probably the greediest person in English criminal history.
John Bodkin Adams was struck off the medical register in November 1957, but he continued to treat loyal patients, and he continued to receive legacies. In 1961, after several unsuccessful applications, Adams was given the right to practice medicine again. He died at the age of 83, outliving many of his accusers. To this day, detectives remain convinced of his guilt. Did John Bodkin Adams get away with the murders of 14 patients? Only Adams can say, and he took that secret to the grave.